Hello and welcome to the EURACTIV debate. I'm Dave Keating, and today we're going to be talking about EU-Kazakhstan relations following that country's presidential election earlier this month. It marks a turning point for the country after Nursultan Nazarbayev, Kazakhstan's president since independence from the Soviet Union 3 decades ago, stepped down. But there is an active debate about whether his successor, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, represents a new era or more of the same. We'll explore what's next for this Central Asian country with experts and diplomats both here in Brussels and remotely via satellite in Kazakhstan. Here with me in the studio, we have Boris Irochevich, Head of Division for Central Asia at the European External Action Service, which is the EU's foreign policy arm, and Samuel Doveri-Vesterby, Managing Director of the European Neighbourhood Council, a Brussels-based independent think tank. Joining us remotely via satellite, we have Sayaset Nurbek, Head of Education Products at BTS Digital, a private company in Kazakhstan, and also an independent expert on Kazakhstan politics. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining us for this discussion. Samuel, let's start with you. You actually traveled to Kazakhstan as an election observer for that election on June 9th. Now, in that election, President Tokayev won 71% of the vote, facing off against 6 other government-approved candidates. Now, there were some demonstrations after the election from people who were not happy with how the election was run, and it did come in for some criticism from the OSCE. So from your perspective, having been there on the ground, would you say that these were free and fair elections?
So I think what's important to bear in mind is when you look at a country like Kazakhstan is, of course, that you have the, what you mentioned before, the OSCE present from a long-term perspective, and then you also have some present from a short-term perspective. And you have to think about it as if the long-term perspective of observers take kind of an analysis of the country from the media environment, from the judiciary, how free and fair are the courts, you know, all these kind of long-term factors which influence whether or not you have a transparent, accountable democracy. So that's their job on the long term. Then on the short term, you have election observers also from OSCE under ODIHR, by the way, of which Kazakhstan is a member as well. And what they do is they look at the immediate timing of the election within a few days span before or after, and they take kind of a snapshot and they go with very technical guidelines on whether or not there's been ballot stuffing, whether or not there have been major irregularities, whether counting, tabulation has gone fairly. And I think maybe what's most important when you look at these elections in Kazakhstan is that it was obvious that there were some difficulties and irregularities from the OSCE report with regard to the long-term perspective, but it was also quite clear that, so for example, the media environment had some issues, or for example, permissions on protests and so forth could have been more liberal, could have been more open. But then from the short-term perspective, it was also obvious that there was a lot of reasonably well done election management, coordination, tabulation, and so forth. There were also irregularities within the report, which is publicly available. But I think there was a degree of progress which was seen, which was a good thing.
Now, Boris, when you're looking at the EU's relations with Kazakhstan and now the new president, there was some criticism, or at least the High Representative for Foreign Affairs for the EU, Federica Mogherini, said these issues identified by the OSCE should be looked at by the government. So there's the issues of the actual election, but then of course there's the bigger picture about the transfer of power. And I think that's really what those protests were about. The questioning in a lot of people's minds whether this is really a transfer of power or whether Nazarbayev will be still kind of pulling the strings. How do you view this transfer of power? How do you think the transfer of power has been handled in Kazakhstan so far?
Oh, we have first acknowledged that transfer of power is not easy in regimes like we know in Central Asia. We had other examples in the region. So overall, I think in Kazakhstan, it went relatively peaceful. Of course, we know that President Nazarbayev stays also in power, has become honorary president, is chairing the Security Council. His daughter is the Speaker of the Senate. But nevertheless, I think we see this transition as a first step, which is probably a good example for the region. And of course, the OEC observation report was critical, but we see it as a starting point. And we are ready to work together with Kazakhstan, I mean, to improve the next elections. So it's not perfect, but at least there were 7 candidates, including 1 woman for the first time. One of the opposition candidates got a significant number of votes. So I think for us, we see it in the difficult or in the regional context, we see it as a good step forward.
Samuel, when we're looking at the role of Nazarbayev now going forward, what do you expect will be his role in Kazakhstan politics going forward? Will it maintain this very strong level that it's at now, or do you expect a kind of dissipation over time?
I mean, the way in which I've been looking from a research perspective at Kazakhstan in recent months and years, especially leading up to the election, has been to try to understand, of course, because of the release of the European External Action Service's Central Asia strategy that I'm sure we'll touch on in a bit as well, try to understand what is the potential that comes out of an electoral momentum and that comes out of a new relationship with an economic powerhouse like Europe. So within that context, what I think is important, what I'm trying to say is that within that context, whatever Tokayev does now, I think is very linked to that as well. Because if you look at the situation of Kazakhstan from an economic perspective, what you very quickly realize is that it's a highly, highly resource-dependent country. It has a very little amount of diversification. And of course, from anyone who has an economic background, you're immediately aware of the fact that you run into some issues. Not issues for the European Union or for other countries, but issues for Kazakhstan and its people and its economy, which are things like having fluctuating oil prices and how that impacts your economy. If you look at just the last decade, there's been an enormous amount of oil price fluctuation for a country that depends, I think, about 50% on specifically on gas, and then on oil, and then you add another maybe 5% on ferroalloys, zinc, copper. I mean, we're talking about 80% resource-related dependency economy. That's an issue for Kazakhstan itself, and for its currency as well, and for its potential manufacturing sector or service sector or any other sector that it wishes to go into in the future. So why is this important within the context of the question you asked me about Tokayev and the future of the country? Well, it's vital because only through that perspective of the economy does Kazakhstan develop better relations with other countries. Does Kazakhstan manage to develop its own governance system? Does Kazakhstan manage to democratize? Does Kazakhstan manage to increase its GDP per capita? And in that way, does manage also to be in the first tier of economies? So that's very important to put it in that economic perspective, which is something I've tried to do in my recent research as well.
And as you mentioned, this commodity dependency has been something identified as by the government as potentially problematic, particularly with the fluctuating oil prices. I mean, at the same time, the country does possess great wealth in terms of both minerals and oil and gas. It ranks 9th for proven oil reserves and 2nd for uranium reserves. Sayasat, I mean, from a business perspective in Kazakhstan, how important is that connectivity for diversifying Kazakhstan's economy and also taking advantage of its location on trade routes when you think about China's Silk Road initiative or even digital initiatives that could help in this effort to diversify the economy? How important are those things?
The connectivity, and especially increasing the transit potential, and I totally agree, building up higher value-added chains of production along that transit routes is one of the key pillars of Kazakhstan economic platform. And the economic platform of our second president, Tokayev, is built on succession. So we would just basically continue to focus on connectivity. And Belt and Road Initiative, that's the official name for One Belt, One Road Initiative, coined by Chinese government, is now taking the momentum. Despite the fact it's being highly criticized and discussed and debated, but Chinese government is really fixed on that idea. 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, they've declared a huge, massive investment package of $900 billion investing in Belt and Road Initiative, and bulk of this money would be spread across the Eurasian continent. And Kazakhstan is key in this huge infrastructure project. And you know how they call Kazakhstan, and in China, we've been talking to our Chinese colleagues, they have the One Belt, One Road program, and they call Kazakhstan buckle in the belt, because it's right in the middle, and it kind of connects this logic of building this logistic hub. So being buckle in the belt, we would have to be very cautious of how to deal with these investments, and as part of this infrastructure plan, majority of the roads are already being built. Now there's a huge connecting project on border with China, the Horgos transit logistics hub, customs and logistics hubs. And then the huge logistic hub is built in the capital, in Nur Sultan. And then the next connecting dot would be a huge logistic hub in Moscow and Belarus, and then it just connects to Europe. So it's a big project, and it will certainly take some time. We are certainly focused in implementing this project, at least our part of this larger infrastructure plan. And our hopes, given this opportunity, the Kazakhstan's opportunity, given the number of, the amount of investment flowing through this project, build production hubs along the Belt and Road, and diversify our economy, build this higher value-added chain so that we could have a better use for this huge flow of goods and services flowing through our territory. So that's, in a nutshell, the vision to be part of that larger infrastructure platform.
Let's talk about EU-Kazakhstan relations. Boris, you mentioned this high-level business connection that's going to be launched. Now, obviously, the EU is making up a huge part of Kazakhstan's trade right now, as I believe it's over half in terms of exports, a lot of which is oil and gas. But at the same time, the new president has said that his priority at first will be the immediate neighbors, Central Asia, and of course his first visit as interim president was to Moscow rather than to the EU. So how do you view the EU's relations with Kazakhstan as it relates to Kazakhstan's relations with its closest neighbors in Central Asia, with Moscow and with Beijing?
We try to build a non-exclusive relationship with all the countries in Central Asia. As Samuel said, we just issued a month and a half ago a new strategy on Central Asia, which updates the first one, which was produced in 2007. So that's the frame of our relation with the 5 countries which are part of Central Asia for us. We also built bilateral relations with each of the countries, and in the case of Kazakhstan, we have what we call an enhanced partnership and cooperation agreement. So it was already back in 2015 when we signed it. It was a modernized agreement, really going much further than the one which was signed in the 90s after the fall or collapse of the Soviet Union. And we know at the same time that Kazakhstan is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, is member of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So for us, there is no contradiction, and all agreements that we sign with Kazakhstan, with the others in Central Asia, are non-exclusive and should benefit everybody. And on the contrary, I think it's good that Kazakhstan has this multi-vector policy, that it can sell goods in Russia, in the Eurasian Economic Union, it can sell goods in China, it can sell goods in the EU. So for us it's extremely important to keep this non-exclusive or inclusive approach. On the other hand, I think Kazakhstan has a big role to play in Central Asia. I mean, it's the richest country, and we have seen that he plays a very important role in coordinating and a little bit developing rather a regional cooperation in Central Asia. I mean, as the most, let's say, economically advanced country, has a specific place and role in Central Asia. Kazakhstan is also extremely active in Afghanistan, which is a challenge for the whole region. And there, I mean, we are working on trilateral projects where EU is working with Kazakhstan, but also with others, and with Afghanistan. I mean, to promote this regional integration, regional cooperation, exchange of students, business contacts, and so on. And also, as a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, Kazakhstan can also play a role, let's say, kind of trying to build bridges with the European Union. So I think we are very conscious of the role that Kazakhstan can play in the region, and we see absolutely no problem that Kazakhstan is engaged in other organizations, in other agreements. We share a number of same values. We are all members of the OSCE, which was mentioned earlier. We see that this, let's say, multi-vector policy will continue under the next president. Our new agreement should fully enter into force very soon. We have still only one member state to ratify it. And then we will be fully equipped to develop further our relations with Kazakhstan. We will have the regional strategy covering the entire region and facilitating cooperation among the 5 countries. And we will have this bilateral agreement which will guide also our work with Kazakhstan.
Now, the election was an unforeseen development, and as you mentioned, it was a welcome first step in the EU's eyes. Would you say that the election fundamentally changes anything about the EU and Kazakhstan's relationship?
No, at this stage, not yet, I would say. Of course, we followed the conclusions of the observation mission that there have been some irregularities during the election day. Also, we were concerned, we will not hide it, by the arrests which took place after the election. About 4,000 people were arrested. But now we see that the situation is normalizing. We also took note that violence was limited on the side of the police. I mean, that's also clear. So far, I think we see no change to the worse in our relation. On the contrary, and I already mentioned this high-level platform, long-awaited, which will take place tomorrow on the 28th of June. I think that's a very good sign that Kazakhstan is keen to continue the relation and to deepen it.
Samuel, the ECPA that was agreed in 2015, it's still not that long ago. Have we really felt the effects of the ECPA yet? And if so, how?
Well, I think it's maybe important to bear in mind that when we talk about the enhanced partnership and cooperation agreement, we're talking about harmonization of legislation. At the end of the day, we're talking about, Boris before mentioned, renewable energy. So when we look at a trade agreement like that, we have to look at it slightly differently than the typical trade agreement that we would have with a country like the Ukraine, or with a country like, for example, Turkey, the enhanced customs union, reformed customs union, and so on. So the difference is primarily the fact that because Kazakhstan is within an agreement already within the, with Russia and with other countries, within the spectrum of the Eurasian Economic Union, it makes it a little bit more difficult to have an enhanced trade agreement that has the same levels of trade or free trade, as I would call it, as other countries. So what's important to focus on when we look at this specific trade agreement with Kazakhstan is a regulatory harmonization which is occurring. Now, why is it so important to regularize and harmonize laws and legislation to the European acquis? Well, there are two reasons for that. Number one, it's extremely important, for example, in sectors like Boris mentioned before, in renewables. In order to play at the world level field of renewable sustainability, circular economy, and all of these kind of obviously future policy components of energy, it's important to have a regulatory framework which is WTO standards plus. WTO standards are already a very good level, but you can go well beyond that. And these subcommittees which have been set up both within trade, both within energy and other sectors do exactly that. And they're ongoing between the EU and Kazakhstan, and I think will yield quite a lot of success. The second reason is maybe to take a neighboring or somewhat neighboring country, not exactly geographically neighboring country, but to look at Turkey. Turkey, which shares a lot of culture with Kazakhstan, there's a degree of linguistic similarity and so forth, and historic similarity. When you look at Turkey, especially between the years of 2000, 2002 and 2013, and you look at the economic development which occurred, the boom which happened to Turkey, which basically turned Turkey or helped Turkey transit from at best, medium level income country to a truly developed country in economic terms, at least, with a manufacturing industry, with a defense industry, and you name it. The reason for that is because they align with the European acquis. And I think Kazakhstan's new government is probably well aware of that.
Sayasat, how important would you say the EPCA has been for businesses in Kazakhstan, and maybe particularly looking forward for the reasons Samuel mentioned for the harmonization regions? I mean, is it something that businesses in Kazakhstan are viewing as a game changer?
Well, in general, let me just really quickly step back and in general say that EU has always been one of the key partners for Kazakhstan. One of my trainings as well as in geopolitics, let me just give you a little bit of informal touch, given the multi-vectoral policy we have in international relations. I was in Canada once, visiting Canadian civil service institution, training institution, and I would ask them, so how are you doing in Canada? And they'd say, well, it's like sleeping in a bed with an elephant. Yeah, you have to always keep one eye open, meaning the US. So you would understand that we're living in a quite interesting neighborhood. So you got to keep both eyes really open. And I think there's quite interesting opportunity now for European Union. You see three major forces shaping the balance of powers in the region with Russia, China, and the US. And in the last decade, we've seen US retracting from the region. And there's quite an interesting vacuum, political, economical vacuum, which is now being really quickly filled in by Chinese. So I think European Union has quite interesting now chance being the key partner, one of these key partners, to have more, how do I put that, to fill in more space in terms of economic relations. So coming back to ECBA, I think yes, it has now a chance to play a more active role. Why? Because reason number one, the businesses are really actively in Kazakhstan now, really actively seeking foreign investments. The package in the last 10 years, we've seen some, they were not easy 10 years, the last decade economically for Kazakhstan and countries in the region. So government is being very active in giving in, filling in, pouring a lot of investments to boost economic activity, to support businesses and SMEs. But now it's quite clear that then on the other side there's a social package, there's social obligation, and there's this wealth distribution problem, and Tokayev's administration is now giving a lot of focus on social issues. So businesses and SMEs are now actively seeking for other sources of investments, and foreign investments, FDIs are seeing as the most key area where we can get more support to boosting economic activity. So I think there's I think the ECBA and the European Union in general now there's quite an interesting window of opportunity to take a more active role in building up and strengthening relationships, giving more investments. Another interesting thing that was mentioned, one of the things that have been changing in the region in the last several years, is that the Central Asian Union, the Central Asian cooperation of these 5-6 countries in the region, which was not very obvious and strong because of other reasons in last decades, now becoming more clear, and now there's a shift to tightening economic and political ties between the countries in the region. So now we're talking not only about Kazakhstan and one of the most economically developed countries, we're talking about 70-80 million people market, which is now becoming more real. Yeah, and there might be another, apart from Eurasian Economic Union, there might be a different economic reality in the region. And we've seen that the new Uzbekistan, leadership in Uzbekistan and in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and now in Kazakhstan, they've seen this, so there's this historic chance to reset the discrepancies, reset the tensions which were present in regional cooperation, and kind of build up new reality. Yeah? So I think European Union does have a chance in terms of countries in the region, especially Kazakhstan, to take a more active role. And I totally agree that Turkey is a good example for us. The standards, the industrial standards, the regulatory frameworks which were incorporated from European countries build a platform, a framework for countries' shift, escaping from this middle income trap and really becoming a developed country. So there is a clear intention now, clear understanding. We've made our mistakes. The Dutch disease, the curse, the resources curse, it's all being there. We made all the possible mistakes. Now there's a clear understanding of what to do and what not to do. And in a nutshell, I think that the EU and Kazakhstan and countries in the region have now should aim to build more pragmatic, more deeper relationships, both in economic and political fields.
Boris, let me go to you for a final question before we wrap up, which is about next steps in this relationship. What do you think is key to achieve in the next 5 years, or things that could develop in the next 5 years, after which you would deem the EU-Kazakhstan relationship a real success story?
We have I think, to fully implement this new agreement. Kazakhstan is working on a roadmap, so they are taking it extremely seriously. I mean, all the legal step and all the structural step that they have to take to implement this agreement. That will be our task in the coming years. I mean, to really put into life this agreement, which is still provisionally in force, because we wait the last ratification by one member state. And we have let's say, a machinery of fora to do that. I mean, the EPCA has expanded the fora where we can discuss very concrete issues in the field of customs, in the field of energy, in the field of environment. So really we can go down to very concrete, pragmatic things So for me, the main objective, the joint mutual objective, will be to fully realize the potential of the EPCA. But we have also a lot of homework to do. Kazakhstan and also us at the EU, I mean, to work together with Kazakhstan to implement all the provisions of the new agreement.
Well, there's certainly a lot of areas to explore there. I'd like to thank all of our guests for a great discussion, both here in Brussels and in Kazakhstan. And also, thank you so much at home for watching.